So would you like me to start, Sam? Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this presentation about our local plan process. I'm Flo Churchill, and I'm the service director who looks after planning amongst a few other services at Herefordshire. I'm a passionate believer in the value of parish council involvement in our planning process, so I hope you find it useful this evening. It's the first opportunity for you to engage in our local plan process. We have started the initial consultation on a series of high-level spatial options. We began that on the 17th of January. And today's workshop provides a chance for you to find out more about the spatial options and provide some initial feedback regarding the advantages and disadvantages of the published options. You will get the opportunity to ask some questions. So the session this evening is going to begin with Susie, who will introduce the consultation platform, and then two of our other officers, Vic and Carla, will begin a presentation setting out the spatial options. We want you to use the chat facility for any questions. And if we're not able to get back to you with a response today, we will respond to you later, and this presentation will be available on our website. Are we going to be going into breakout rooms this evening or not?
Not today, Flo, no.
Okay, that's brilliant. At the end of this workshop, there'll be a second presentation where we look at the spatial options for the rural parts of the county. And then at the end, we will go into the details of the next step in the plan making process. And as I've said before, the session will be recorded and it will be available via our council website. So I'm going to hand over to Susie to explain more about the consultation platform that we're using.
Good evening, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. The first thing I'm going to show you, which is actually on the website, is a video introduction from Councillor Harvey and my colleague Angela, who will just explain a brief overview of the document before I go into more detail about the website. So I'm just going to share the website first.
My name is Councillor Liz Harvey and I'm the Cabinet Member responsible for planning. We've all been living with our current development framework since it was adopted in 2015. And it's now time for us to update that plan and extend it a further 10 years into the future. So that's out to 2041. If you're viewing this video, it's because you're already somehow interested in this subject. So thank you for getting involved. Please encourage friends and colleagues also to participate. I'm keen that we hear from as many different voices as possible at this early stage in the process. This first consultation seeks your views on a range of top-level options for how jobs and homes get developed in our communities. It's important to choose the right growth options now, as these will shape the detail of the policies that follow. After viewing this introductory video, I hope you'll go on to participate in this important consultation. I look forward to hearing your views.
This short presentation provides some background information about the new local plan prepared by Herefordshire Council and the current consultation on which we are now seeking the views. The local plan will be part of the Herefordshire Development Plan, together with the Minerals and Waste Local Plan and Neighbourhood Development Plans prepared by the Town and Parish Councils. Supplementary planning documents will provide more detail on specific issues as required. All of these will need to take into account government guidance and local strategies, including the Council's county plan. The local plan is important as it will help shape new development in Herefordshire up to 2041 by setting out a pattern of development that meets the county's need for housing and other land uses. The local plan must also ensure that adequate infrastructure is provided to support the new development and that strong policies are in place that will help the county mitigate and adapt to climate change. The local plan provides the framework for town and parish councils to prepare neighbourhood plans for their local areas and it will be used as the basis for all planning decisions made in the county. The specific local options consultation on which we are seeking your views includes the following. Firstly, there is a positive and aspirational vision which paints a picture of what the county will be like in 2041. This is complemented by a more detailed set of objectives. Together, the vision and objectives will provide the framework for the land use pattern and policies in the local plan. So it is important that you let us know your views on them. We provide an overview of some of the key characteristics and issues for Hereford, the market towns of Bromyard, Kington, Ledbury, Leominster and Ross-on-Wye, and the rural areas of the county. This is the background information and is intended to help people decide about the different options. Thirdly, we explain how much housing needs to be developed up to 2041 and how this figure is arrived at. Then there are 5 different strategic spatial options which set out how much new housing could be located in Hereford and the market towns. These also include a total number that can be distributed within the rural areas under each option. These are looking at overall numbers and not at specific locations for development at this stage. We would welcome your views on the different options and you will be able to rank them in order of preference. In the 4th section, we take a closer look at the rural areas and how housing might be distributed amongst the settlements, depending on their size, function, and the levels of services they have. There are 4 different options for this. Again, it is important for us to know your views on these to help us take the local plan forward to the next stage. In the final section, we provide more information about the evidence we will be collecting on different topics over the next few months, and it also includes information about a call for sites for a potential new village in the county. The local plan, when finalised, will address many other issues in addition to housing, but at this stage, we are focusing on this topic and the vision and objectives. To see the consultation in full and to answer the survey questions, please follow the links on the webpage. We need to receive your comments by the 28th of February 2022. We look forward to hearing from you and thank you for listening.
Apologies for anybody who had problems with the sound quality there. As you can see, the video is actually on the website. So for anybody that would like to view that video again, it's available for you there whenever you need it. So I'm going to do my best to explain my way around the website so that you're aware of the main features of it. But obviously, if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat and I'll do my best to answer those. If I don't get a chance to answer them this evening, I will get back to you if you have any queries. And if there's a question that comes up subsequent to the meeting, please do drop me a line and I'll do my best to answer as quickly as I can. So the main features of the website are, starting at the top, people now have the opportunity to register their details so they can continue to receive updates as and when there's new news. We will be sending out regular updates throughout the story of the development of the local plan, and that's a chance for people to register their interest and continue to be updated. So as I say, there's the video of Councillor Harvey and Angela there, and then scrolling down, you'll see there are a number of tiles. So these squares all represent chunks of the document itself. So there are various different ways that you can view the document. It's been broken down into chunks, which represent the different sections of the document. And starting with the overview, if you go into any of the sections, you'll see that there's a brief summary, but it also includes a PDF where you can click on this and it will show you that section of the document. In this particular tile, you can also see where all the different sections are and you can go into each of those. That's one way of accessing each of those sections. Going back to the home page, you have the vision and objectives, and then also you have various different sections, including both sets of options. And as you can see, and this is something new, completely new for us, anybody who's viewing the website who'd like to see what other people have had to say can actually go in and have a look at the responses. And I'll show you that in more detail in a moment. a lot of the sections have questions individually in them, and there's a few questions with each of the individual sections, but you can also go to have your say here, and you can access all of those sections, but you can also go straight to the questions. So depending on how you want to look at it and what information you've already seen, you're able to access those questions more easily, depending on how you want to do it. So if we go into the growth levels and strategic spatial options, you have the option to go straight to the questions. So there are a number of different layers to this particular section. So you can go straight to the questions at the end, or you can look at each individual part of the options from the front, or you can scroll through. So if you scroll down, and you can just go through at your leisure and read through page by page. It's completely up to you. Another way of viewing the document, if you prefer not to see it in pieces, is if you scroll down to the bottom, there's a document library, and the document library will build as time goes on. At the moment, it just contains the consultation document, and that is where you have a PDF of the document in its entirety if you want to read it as a whole. When you actually answer the questions, what you'll find is that when you answer the first section of the questions, it will ask you a few questions about yourself, including asking you to confirm your email address. The main reason for this is to confirm that you are an actual person and to validate your submission. It won't ask you those questions again once you've answered them for the first time. And what you'll find is you'll receive an email from Commonplace, who house this website, and they will ask you just to verify yourself. And once you've done that, it's a fully verified submission. All submissions are valid. It doesn't mean they're not, but it means that they will either be fully verified or not fully verified. So going back to what I was saying about being able to see the responses, if you click on any of the tiles and have a look at the number of responses, what you'll be able to do, which you haven't been able to do before, is to actually look at what people have been saying. So you'll be able to see all of the comments that have been made, but you'll also be able to agree if there's something you feel particularly strongly about, and you'll be able to see where other people have agreed as well. The latest news section will build as time goes on. At the moment, there's just one submission that I sent out last week. But as the local plan develops and as there are things that we need to tell people, by registering their interest, it means that we can actually send the updates out directly from here. And we can keep people updated. So there, as you can see, there are various ways of getting around the website and viewing the information. As I said, if anybody has any questions at all with regard to this and they'd like to know more, or they're unsure about something, please do come back to me, because I'm always interested to know what you think and how you're getting on with it. The only other thing I need to mention is the call for new settlements. As you may or may not know, there's a section in the document with regard to a new settlement in the county, and this is the opportunity for anybody, a landowner or an agent, to submit details by going into the call for new settlement tile and putting in their details, and they'll be asked a number of questions, which are the standard questions they would be asked if they were submitting some land. It's all anonymous. There's no personal information in there, but it's a chance for my colleague Stuart to receive the basic information about the land, and then the landowner or the agent also gets the opportunity to send more detail. And so that's really it as far as the website goes. I'm now going to hand you over to Vic. I'm going to unshare and hand you over to Vic, who will take you through the first section of the options.
Good evening, everyone. Just before I start on the options, I just wanted to remind you about the fact that you can use the chat function if you want to ask any questions about anything that you'd like answers to in this evening's presentation. So as part of this local plan spatial options consultation, we've outlined 5 broad options for you to consider. And each of these proposes a distinct pattern and scale of distribution of residential growth across Hereford, the 5 market towns and the rural areas of our county over the 20-year plan period, and that runs from 2021 to 2041. This consultation is primarily focused on how to accommodate new housing growth across the county. But of course, residential development doesn't happen in isolation, and planning for the future growth of the county will also involve consideration of other important supporting land use issues, such as the location and scale of employment land and the provision of infrastructure and services. So these and other matters will be addressed at a later stage of the local plan's preparation. So how many new houses does Herefordshire actually need to accommodate up to 2041? Well, local planning authorities across the whole country calculate their local housing requirement using the government's standard methodology. And this determines how many dwellings need to be delivered each year. And for Herefordshire, this standard method indicates that 850 new dwellings per year are required. And this translates to a total of 17,000 homes over the next 20 years. The spatial options that I'm going to present to you will also, however, take into account the existing 5,800 planning permissions for new homes that have already been granted. And this reduces, therefore, the 17,000 figure to a need for 11,000 dwellings over the plan period up to 2041. If you'd like to have a look at more detailed information on the county's housing need, this can be found on the council's website in the Housing Market Area Needs Assessment study, which was published in July 2021. As well as housing requirements, other issues also have to be considered when we're planning for new growth. For example, the local plan will be closely integrated with the Hereford Transport Strategy Review and the local transport plan, which will be updated within the next 18 months, as well as with other local strategies relating to various matters such as climate change or economic development, for example. Also, please note that further work will be needed to review the impact of transport in respect of the options within this consultation. And this consultation is also based on the understanding that the current restrictions on development in the Lug catchment to do with water quality issues will be resolved at an early stage of the updated plan period. And so we go to the options. The following slides set out 5 options which show the way that development could be distributed across the county, with each one setting out a distinct and different approach. So what you'll see is that each option displays a map and a table showing the rounded up housing figures for Hereford, the market towns and the rural areas, taking into account those commitments, those homes that already have planning permission. And there's also a pie chart which shows the proportions of growth by area. The map also shows the scale of the development under each options, defined as low, medium or high growth levels. But this is proportionate in the sense that what's a high level of growth for Kington, for example, would be a low level of growth for Hereford. So option 1, this is the housing need baseline distribution. This option is based completely on the market demands for housing that are identified in the Housing Market Area Needs Assessment from last year. The purpose of this study was to provide a robust evidence of the levels of housing need across Herefordshire's 7 housing market areas. And this option would, broadly speaking, represent a continuation of a strategy similar to that in the existing core strategy, resulting in sustained growth in the larger market towns, Hereford, and the rural areas respectively. With regard to the market towns, their role as thriving service centres will continue to be emphasised. Bromyard and Kington would experience more moderate development due to their smaller size, and Ledbury too is identified for limited growth as it has already met its housing targets through existing permissions. It would need to be ensured that the market towns could accommodate the proposed levels of growth within their environmental constraints, whilst maintaining their distinctiveness. In Hereford, a transport assessment would be required to determine whether the city can continue to accommodate the level of growth proposed in this option in light of changes to the transport strategy for the city. And as you can see, compared with Hereford City and the market towns, the highest proportion of identified housing need is in the rural areas. That's that purple segment on the map. So trends in housing delivery in these rural areas have been strong historically, so similar levels of development to those seen currently would continue if this growth distribution option were to be followed. But it is still important to note that there are various options for distribution of the rural proportion of the growth, that purple segment of the pie chart, and these will be described to you in the next presentation. The rural share of development could mean a broader distribution of growth with a more localised focus on meeting housing need, and could have a role to play in delivering rural affordable housing. However, spreading development more thinly in this option for distribution could result in limited individual benefits for some areas, i.e. the delivery of key infrastructure and facilities that could only be achieved from larger scale developments. And it could also lead to a broader, more county-wide increase in traffic levels. The next option, option 2, is a focus on the market towns and rural-based growth. So in this option, you'd see a dispersed growth across the county's 5 market towns and the rural areas, while significantly lowering the housing requirements in Hereford City. So following the decision not to proceed with the South Wye and Hereford transport packages in the existing core strategy, this approach could afford more flexibility as the city's transport strategy evolves. This option could potentially increase affordable housing and infrastructure delivery in both the market towns and the rural areas, so helping to address the imbalances between Hereford City and these areas in this regard. The distribution apportioned to each market town would be determined by localised constraints and site availability and suitability. And as mentioned in the last option, the distribution for the rural portion of the growth would be determined separately, the options for which will be set out in the next presentation. For Hereford, this option would deliver significantly less than the housing need identified in the Housing and Market Areas Needs Assessment, and it could weaken the city's ability to attain affordable housing and infrastructure. Though conversely, it could reduce pressure on the city's existing infrastructure and services. And it could also reduce the reliance on large urban extensions like those in the existing core strategy, for which delivery trends have not been reliable. And it would also take account of Hereford's environmental constraints, such as areas prone to flooding and phosphate levels in the River Wye. The third option I'm going to present to you is focusing growth across the market towns and Hereford. This distribution option would focus greater growth across the county's market towns and Hereford. And the result would be significant uplift in growth levels for the market towns, with reduced growth in Hereford and a significant decrease in the rural areas when compared with option 1. This would direct development to areas that can support and enhance existing services, infrastructure and businesses, albeit with some of these likely requiring expansion. Broadly speaking, it's consistent with the settlement hierarchy for the county as a whole and would generally support the principle of sustainable development. Conversely, though, this option could lead to a stagnation of the age structure in the county's rural villages, with a reduction in housing stock that would otherwise help retain the younger population. Restraining development in these rural areas could also mean that some villages would struggle to retain their services. As with option 1, for this pattern of distribution, we would need to ensure that the market towns could accommodate such an uplift in growth within their environmental constraints and without losing their local distinctiveness. By placing an emphasis on larger urban expansion sites, there could be potential to attain higher levels of affordable housing and to deliver more planned, sustainable, better connected patterns of development. But historic low levels of delivery must also be taken into consideration. The fourth option is the single market town growth option. Here you would see one of the county's larger market towns, namely Ledbury, Ross or Leominster, be made a focus for growth. The result of this would be that one of these 3 towns would have an approximate growth target of 2,000 new dwellings. Hereford City would have a growth target of 4,000, with the rural areas having significantly reduced target compared with that of the existing core strategy, totalling around 3,300. The choice of the 3 candidate towns of Leominster, Ledbury and Ross was based on their existing role as service centres and their potential capacity to accommodate such a level of growth. Determining which of these would be best placed to take growth would be subject to more detailed assessment of land availability and suitability in each of the towns. The slide in this presentation shows Leominster as the growth town. However, all the sub-options for Ledbury and Ross as well can be seen on the Commonplace website. You may note that Bromyard and Kington have not been included as candidates for growth town statuses, and this is because of their significant planning constraints, their reduced capacity for development, and their limited levels of services and infrastructure, owing to their significantly smaller sizes. The last option, option 5, this sets out a new rural settlement with growth focused in Leominster and Bromyard. This option proposes 1 or more new settlements located in a rural area of the county. This could deliver over 1/3 of the overall rural housing growth target if carried forward. And should a 1,500 dwelling new settlement be delivered, Leominster and Bromyard would see proportionate large-scale growth, with more moderate targets in Hereford and Ross. The remainder of the targets would be distributed across the existing rural settlements. The new settlement in question would need to be in a location that's well connected physically, economically, and socially with existing villages and settlements. And whilst there would need to be service provision that allows for some degree of self-sufficiency, the settlement should not be too isolated, and neither must it have a detrimental effect on the viability or vitality of existing centres by diverting economic activity away from them. The new settlement would need to be accessible by sustainable modes of transport, and therefore located either on a rail route or somewhere that can be easily served by bus. To carry this option forward and for it to deliver its objectives, there would be a number of requirements. Firstly, the settlement would need to be of an appropriate size that could support the development of the associated services that the new community would need. Taking a baseline figure, a 1,500 dwelling settlement could support a new primary school and a local centre. Therefore, a large assembly of appropriate land for development would need to be made available, and in an area that would not cause unacceptable damage to local ecology, landscape, historic value, or future climate resilience. And if possible, use should be made of brownfield land. However, it is acknowledged that this would be quite challenging in the rural areas. It also should be made clear that this would be a lengthy process. Delivering new settlements requires comprehensive master planning and has long lead-in times, and therefore delivery would most likely be towards the latter end of the plan period. A 1,500 dwelling settlement would be expected to see an average of 150 dwellings built each year. However, whilst growth of a new settlement may be limited over the plan period, it may be that more homes and services could be accommodated post-2041 in a new plan period. So you've now had an overview of the 5 options. Please do take the opportunity to look through them again on the Commonplace public consultation website. And then we'd really like to hear your views on how you would like to see Herefordshire growing over the next 20 years. We want to know what's important to you. Is it the overall sustainability of the options? Which of the county's urban areas do you think would be best suited to growth? And would you like to see a brand new modern village developed somewhere in the county? If you're wondering what the context is for making a decision on which spatial distribution you would like to see developed, have a look back to the vision and objectives of the local plan. These are available on Commonplace, as Susie showed you earlier, and it is these which are the drivers for how we would like the county to grow over the next 20 years. And also, please consider that the 5 options that have been presented to you are not set in stone. Depending on the responses we receive, the final pattern of distribution that goes forward into the local plan could actually be a hybrid of several of these options that you've heard about today. So just to remind you again, you can make your comments via the strategic Spatial Options public consultation website at https://hlp.commonplace.is/. And the closing date for responses is the 28th of February this year. I'll hand you over now to my colleague Carla Johnson, and she's going to present to you the options for how the homes in rural areas could be distributed. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. Good evening all. So in this section, I will talk about the rural areas spatial options. As you saw in the previous slides, there are varying levels of growth for each strategic option as shown on the pie charts and overall figures in the tables. This does vary across the board for the city, town and rural areas. So the outcome for the rural options will be influenced by the strategic option choices. Likewise, what you might see in the rural option may help to determine what your preferred strategic option is. These two sets of options are mutually dependent on one another. If we go to the next slide, this shows the spatial options process for the rural areas. At this stage, it is undecided what amount of growth rural areas will need to accommodate, but we expect they could accommodate up to 6,500 dwellings, and it could be less than this, depending on what strategic options we proceed with. The example figure is a proportion of the overall target, as previously mentioned, of the 17,000 up to 2041. This has been taken from the government standard method and determines how many dwellings will need to be delivered each year. This figure will vary in the rural areas depending on the strategic option selected. Various factors need to be considered before confirming the rural housing figure, including the feedback from the strategic options consultation. The process chart on the slide shows how the evidence base will feed and inform rural strategy and policies right up to the adoption of the local plan. The parish questionnaire, which was sent out before Christmas, has just finished consultation, so we will be looking at all of the responses received and taking them into consideration. Work is underway on the rural areas background paper and settlement hierarchy. So this is our evidence base, which will inform the strategy for development in the rural areas. We are gathering data from various internal teams, as well as utilising the valuable information included with all of your neighbourhood plans. This review will look at the current services, including shops, village halls, schools, nurseries, post offices, petrol stations, medical facilities, talk community hubs, pubs, cafes, restaurants, playgrounds, libraries, petrol stations, to name a few. We will also consider the frequency of some services, such as part-time post offices in village halls or full-time post offices. Infrastructure is another important part of the evidence base. So that will be reviewed, looking at road infrastructure, sewage, drainage, water facilities, access to electric vehicle charging points, access to broadband, looking at the Herefordshire rollout in particular. We'll also look at employment facilities and the rural economy, seeing where employment sites are in the rural areas and proximity to the rural settlements. I think transport as well is another important part of the evidence base, including travel to work, bus services and the frequency of these, as well as access to train stations and general access, as well as population figures. Population forecasting is important, as well as housing needs, and this will be taken into consideration from the Housing Market Area Needs Report. The settlement hierarchy will also factor in environmental constraints of places such as flood risk, AONB, conservation areas, scheduled ancient monuments, landscape topography, and special areas of conservation, to name a few. Accessibility is also very important, and this will help us determine a list of settlements that will be able to accommodate some growth. We anticipate to run the rural settlements hierarchy background paper later in the spring. So this means we'll be able to analyse the results going into summer and further develop the rural areas policy ready for a draft plan. If we go to our next slide. So this is a summary of the rural areas options. This slide illustrates the 4 strategic options considered for distributing housing, rural housing growth. There will be more detail on each option after this slide. So option 1 is a dispersal approach. This reflects the current strategy of the core strategy. This is dispersing housing growth in settlements. As you can see from the pie chart, there are many pieces in this one, and each piece represents a settlement. So many settlements would be identified in this option. Option 2 is housing growth in the larger settlements. The larger settlements would see more growth than a dispersal strategy. Larger proportionate growth would be accommodated in each of the identified settlements. So fewer settlements, which you can see represented in the pie chart. Option 3 would be housing growth in the rural hubs. So this will further reduce the list of settlements where growth can happen. This means more significant group in each settlement. So this will be a limited number of larger settlements, which will cater for more growth. And option 4 is housing growth outside areas of outstanding natural beauty and conservation areas. This would mean focusing development in settlements outside designated areas with limited growth in the areas in the OMB and conservation area. So housing in the conservation areas in A, O and B will be limited. Growth will be developed outside these areas. So if we go on to the next slide, this will give us more detail about option 1. So the dispersal approach. This option is similar to the current rural distribution in the core strategy. This is a dispersed approach across a greater number of settlements. This means less growth in a larger amount of settlements. Settlements will be selected following our results from the reviewed settlement hierarchy and background evidence paper. Possible outcomes of this option would be retention of existing services in the settlements and also a continuation of proportionate growth with a focus on key services that have a good level of accessibility and also taking into account environmental constraints. The downside is it will provide minimal opportunities for affordable housing in villages, as small sites will be coming forward and may not be able to deliver affordable housing. It's also more difficult sustainability wise when you're coming to plan sustainable active travel. So option 2, which is the next slide. So this is focusing on growth in the larger settlements. The purpose of this option is to focus on fewer settlements than in option 1. So it would be moving away from the current strategy of wide dispersal to a more limiting strategy across a reduced number of rural settlements. This rural option will see a higher proportion of growth in and around an identified number of settlements considered suitable for growth. These settlements are likely to have a reasonable level of accessibility, services and facilities with adequate transport links. It should also provide a better range of housing to meet needs, including an ageing population, but this will also require further detail. It could also help facilitate investment in infrastructure such as schools, health facilities and open spaces. Provision for sustainable transport is more likely to be achieved, and also it can help to sustain current village services and potentially enhance these. For option 3 in the next slide, this is growth in the rural hubs. So under this option, all rural growth is focused at a small number of key settlements. So of all of these options, this would have the least amount of settlements identified. This would also result in more dwellings at each hub location. It is anticipated that those identified would have good levels of public transport links with wider availability and services for fewer environmental effects. Ultimately, this will be chosen because they would have a high level, high level function. It will act as a service centre for the rural hinterlands. The concentration of growth in these hubs will mean other settlements would have a reduced level of growth, and it could also be more limiting. The impact of these levels of growth on a settlement could be relatively significant. This would be subject to further work, including with the parish councils, to derive the most appropriate approach and assess the suitability of potential sites through our housing land assessment, which is currently underway. So this option would require larger scale greenfield development on the edge of settlements because there is a limited brownfield land supply in the rural areas. There will also be greater environmental issues to take into account due to more development being concentrated in fewer places to meet the rural growth target. Opportunities for placemaking are increased to incorporate additional facilities such as open space, green infrastructure and community facilities, for example. There is much to consider with schools and how they will be affected by these increased populations. So if we go to the next slide, this will show rural areas option 4. So growth outside areas of outstanding natural beauty and conservation area. So this option reflects the proposal set out in the planning white paper published in 2020, where AONBs and conservation areas were identified as needing more protection. Therefore, the potential for development and growth inside these areas could be quite limited. For context, overall, there are about 40 conservation areas in rural Herefordshire, as well as 2 AMBs. So the Morven Hills and the Wye Valley AMBs cover around 15 to 20% of Herefordshire. There are also around 18 villages that were identified as a 4.14 in the current core strategy, which will fall under those 2 AONBs in total. So the outcomes for this option would mean larger settlements outside AONBs and conservation areas, which may receive a greater proportion of growth. It would also help to sustain villages such as service centres, create affordable housing and sustainable travel outside these areas. On the plus side, limited growth in the AMBs and conservation areas have benefits that, it may assist in protecting the natural and built environment. However, some of the larger settlements that contain many key services are reasonably accessible, and restricting growth may have negative effects in these areas and retaining services. At this stage, we don't know where central government will continue with this approach through guidance and legislation, but it's likely to be confirmed probably later on this year. So in summary, option 1 will have a wide dispersal of housing over many settlements, but each settlement will have smaller proportionate growth. So the strategy is akin to the current one. Option 2, housing growth in the larger settlement. This list of settlements will get smaller, but the level of growth per settlement would increase. And option 3, housing growth in the rural hubs option. This list of settlements will be even smaller, focusing on villages that will act as service centres for the rural hinterlands. So this will be defined by our evidence base and consultation. And option 4, housing growth outside OMB and conservation areas, will limit growth within the OMB and conservation areas. So growth will be focused outside these. So Kevin now will take you through the next steps. Sorry, I think he's having a technical issue with the muting. There we go. Hello, Kevin.
Hello, sorry about that. Yeah, I was unable to unmute myself for a minute. I'm Kevin Singleton. I'm the Strategic Planning Manager, and I'm just going to outline the sort of programme over the next 12 months or so in terms of the plan. Clearly, there's a desire by the council to accelerate the development of this new plan as quickly as possible, and as a result of that, rather than having a single consultation on a set of policy options and so on, that section of the plan making process will be divided. So this consultation runs to the end of the month. But I have put a comment in, particularly, we recognise parish councils don't necessarily meet that frequently. So if we're aware of that, and you can let us know when you will be able to respond following your next meeting. If we're aware of that, then we can accommodate the comments that you make at that time. But there is this desire to progress the plan as quickly as possible, and quite quickly on from this consultation, we will be looking at running another consultation on the actual topic policies, and so we'll be looking at a variety of housing, employment, environmental protection, a whole suite, and how we can, what the approach is to those policies. It won't be the policy wording themselves at that stage, but it will be what approaches can we take towards developing those policies, what range and suite of policies do we need, and so on. So that will be a further consultation in the spring. We will then be looking at more specific place-based policy options, potentially looking at sites or areas where development might take place. Again, that will be in the first half of this year that we're looking at running consultations on those areas. The ambition is to try and get a draft plan in place by the end of this year for the full council, Herefordshire Council, to consider that very early in the new year. And then we would look to submit that plan to the Secretary of State for examination in public around the middle of next year. On that basis, from that point, the plan is out of our hands, it's with the Secretary of State, but we would imagine a 12-month examination in public with the plan being adopted around the middle of 2024. So that's the process that we're aiming on. That's a very tight sort of time scale. The average timeline for producing a local plan in the past has been 7 years. That's across the country. So we are trying to accelerate that, and the team is working very hard to try and accomplish that. Thank you. What I would say is we've been trying to respond to comments as they've been coming through. We probably haven't managed to do that to them all because they've been coming through quite thick and fast. So we will review all the chat and complete a response to every question, and then we'll try and post that with the video and everything on the website with everything else. So again, I mean, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everyone for taking part. We've had some really good questions, and you know, hopefully we'll get good responses from you all. At this stage, these are a series of options. The final option could well be a hybrid. It's probably not going to be any one of these in full. And in terms of the scope of options, we could have come up with thousands of different options. We had to come up with a manageable, discrete set of options for people to consider. There may be things that you think we haven't considered. Please let us know if there's an option that you think that's better than these that we've not thought about. I don't believe, has everyone else got anything else to say from my team before we leave, or have we covered everything? Is there, we could, if you like, leave it open for another 5 minutes if anyone's got any burning questions that they want to stick in the chat, and we'll try and come back to that later if we've not covered that, if that is helpful to everyone.
Yeah, I'm still answering questions in the chat at the minute,
Okay.
Kev.
Okay, so we'll leave the chat open for a while if anyone wants to add any additional questions. As I say, what the intention is that we will send you a link to this. We'll send also a link to all the parish councils that haven't managed to attend this evening as well, and invite them to ask questions as well over the next week or so. I think that's all our presentations though. So if everyone, clearly people, you know, other than questions, I don't think we've got anything to add to what we said earlier tonight.